There are two names for the same piece of land, two names for the same people. Two names separated by thousands of miles of misunderstanding and thousands of years of history. And the fact that most people today have never stopped to ask why is perhaps the greatest untold story of the ancient world. One name is Persia, a word that conjures golden thrones, silk roads, and kings who ruled over nearly half of all the humans alive on Earth at the time. The other name is Iran, a word that most people associate with headlines, politics, and revolution. But here's the part that nobody ever talks about. These are not two different places. They are the same country, the same soil, the same bloodline, and the people who lived there never called themselves Persians at all. Not once, not ever. They called their land Iran, meaning the land of the Aryans. And they held on to that name with a conviction that no outside power, however large, however well-armed, however convinced of its own permanence, ever fully managed to take away from them. So how did a misunderstanding between ancient Greeks and a rising empire echo all the way into the 21st century? And what happened to the most powerful civilization on Earth? The one that once governed nearly half of humanity when the sands finally shifted beneath it. The answer involves generals and poets, conquerors and priests. A teenage king who changed the religion of an entire nation overnight in one very stubborn language that refused to die no matter how many armies tried to kill it. You would think the story ends somewhere in the distant past. It's buried under ruins and dust. But it does not. Not even close. Because this story is still happening right now. Every single time someone says the word Iran and forgets what that word truly means. Let us go back to around 550 BC, when this entire region was nothing more than a scattered collection of small, competing tribes, people who shared a language and a general culture, but had never been unified under a single ruler. Then came Cyrus the Great, a man whose ambition was so vast that it is difficult even now to fully comprehend it. He built an empire so enormous that at its peak it stretched from the Indus Valley in modern India, all the way west to the Balkans of Greece, an empire that at the height of its power controlled approximately 44% of the entire world's population. Think about that number for a moment. 44%.
Ow.
No empire before it had ever come close. No empire since has matched it. Not Rome, not the Mongols, not the British Empire at the height of its global reach and its considerable confidence that it had seen everything history had to offer. The Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus and his successors was by the single most meaningful measure of human power.
The most dominant political force in the history of civilization, and most people today cannot name its founder without stopping to think.
But here's the part that makes it even more remarkable. This empire was not built on cruelty alone. It came with infrastructure.
It came with a standardized currency so that merchants from India to Greece could trade using the same coins. It came with a royal road so efficient that messages could travel thousands of miles in just a few days. A communication system that would not be seriously rivaled until the modern era. And it came with the Immortals. It's an elite fighting force whose genius lay not just in their training, but in their very concept of organization. Because for every soldier who fell in battle, another immediately stepped forward to take his place, making the army appear infinite, invincible, and utterly unbreakable to anyone who faced them. And what happened next will completely change the way you see the ancient world. When the Greeks first encountered the forces of this empire, they noticed that the kings at the top of this global superpower came from a specific province deep inside the empire called Pars, or Fars. And because the Greeks applied the logic of the part to the whole, they took the name of that one province and used it to describe the entire empire. They called it Persis, then Persia. And from that single moment of geographic misunderstanding forward, the outside world had a name for this civilization that the civilization itself had never chosen. The people inside called it Iran. The people outside called it Persia. And that gap between those two names would quietly grow and deepen and calcify for the next 2,500 years, widening with every treaty, and conquest and foreign king who pointed at a map and said, "That is Persia," without ever asking the people who lived there what they called it. But before we get there, we need to talk about what happened when the empire fell. Because the fall of the Achaemenid Empire is one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortune. By 330 BC, the empire had grown comfortable. The tactics that had conquered the ancient world had not evolved. The military machine that once seemed unstoppable was resting on the glory of what it had been, rather than preparing for what was coming. And what was coming was Alexander the Great, leading a Macedonian army outnumbered 10-1 that somehow impossibly won. Alexander did not just defeat the Achaemenid forces, he burned Persepolis, the gleaming capital, to the ground, and the act was so deliberate, so symbolic, so clearly designed to erase not just a building but a memory, that historians still debate whether it was an accident of a drunken celebration or a cold and calculated statement of total conquest. The political structure of Persia was destroyed in a matter of years. The kings were gone. The empire ceased to exist. But here is the part that nobody ever talks about. The cultural idea of Iran did not die with the empire. It went quiet, went underground. It waited. The way a fire smothered under ash still carries its heat deep in the embers, ready to ignite again the moment the wind changes. And the wind changed sooner than anyone expected. By 224 AD, a new power had risen, the Sassanid Empire. If the Achaemenids built the body of this civilization, the Sassanids built its soul. The Sassanid kings understood something that many rulers of their era did not, that a great empire needs more than soldiers and roads. It needs a story about itself, one that its own people believe in deeply enough to die for. It needs an identity so strong, so vivid, so deeply felt, that no invader can simply march in and replace it. So the Sassanid rulers gave their empire a name in their official texts, a name carved in stone and spoken aloud in the royal courts. They called it Aranshar, meaning the Empire of the Iranians, and deliberately distinguished it from everything outside its borders, which they labeled Aniran, the Noon Iranian lands. For nearly 4 centuries, Aranshar stood as the equal of Rome, matching the most powerful empire in the Western world in art, in architecture, in administration, and in military strength. You would think that an empire this powerful and this culturally rich would be nearly impossible to topple. But the 7th century had very different plans. Long wars with the Byzantine Empire had bled the Sassanid borders dry, draining the treasury and exhausting the generals. And in the heat and dust of the Arabian Peninsula, a new force was gathering strength that nobody in the great courts of Aranshar had thought to take seriously. In 651 AD, the Sassanid Empire collapsed under the Arab-Muslim conquests. And it was the most critical turning point in Iranian history because of what happened immediately after. In most places where Arab armies conquered, the local culture eventually dissolved. Egypt became Arab. Syria became Arab. The languages shifted. The old identities faded and disappeared, absorbed into something new and powerful. But Iran did not do that. The Persians converted to Islam genuinely, deeply, and permanently. But they refused, with a stubbornness that is almost admirable in its quiet defiance, to become Arab. They kept their language, they kept their customs, kept the deep bones of their ancient identity, even as they built an entirely new religious life on top of them. And what followed was one of the strangest paradoxes in all of recorded history. The Arab rulers who now controlled this land found that actually governing it required skills they simply did not possess. The Persian administrative system was so sophisticated, so intricately developed over centuries of practice, the new conquerors had no real choice but to hire the very people. They had conquered to run the machinery of government for them. Persians became the bureaucrats of the Arab Empire. They wrote the accounts, they organized the provinces, they kept the whole complicated system running. And in doing so, they kept their language alive, because the language used to govern. Used in official letters and legal documents and administrative records, cannot easily be stamped out overnight. But the Persian language was not merely surviving, it was fighting back. And when it chose its weapon, it chose one that no army could defeat. Around the year 1000 AD, a poet named Ferdowsi completed a work so enormous in its ambition and so deliberately proud in its purpose that it would change the course of Iranian history forever. The Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, was a vast epic poem that captured the myths, the legends, and the deep layered history of ancient Iran and told them in pure, powerful, unapologetic Persian. No Arabic, no compromise. No polite acknowledgement that the outside world might prefer a different language. Just the Persian tongue at its most magnificent, declaring to anyone who would read it that this civilization was ancient and proud, and absolutely not finished with its story. Ferdowsi ensured that no matter how many empires came and went, no matter how many languages were imposed from above, the Iranian identity would always have a home that could not be burned down. You would think that after surviving the Arab conquests and producing one of the greatest literary works in human history, this civilization would be granted some measure of peace, some breathing room, some quiet stretch of centuries in which to simply exist without the threat of annihilation pressing in from every direction. But here's the part that will stop you completely. In 1219, Genghis Khan came. What the Mongols did to Iran was not merely a conquest. It was an extinction event. Entire cities were wiped from the map. Once a magnificent center of Persian culture and learning was annihilated so thoroughly that historians still debate the true scale of the deaths. The ancient underground water systems called qanats, which had allowed cities to flourish on the dry Iranian plateau for thousands of years, were deliberately and methodically destroyed, turning fertile land into desert. The population of Iran was reduced so catastrophically that it would not return to pre-Mongol levels until well into the 20th century. 700 years? That is how long it took Iran to recover the population it lost in a single generation of Mongol violence. And yet impossibly, history repeated itself one more time. The Mongols, who had conquered Iran with fire and fury, found that ruling it was an entirely different problem from destroying it. To govern this complex, ancient, deeply layered society, they needed to understand how it worked. And understanding how it worked meant learning Persian, learning the customs, absorbing the culture. Over time, Persian seeped into the courts of the conquerors. The Mongol rulers of Iran began writing in Persian, commissioning Persian art, and building Persian-style architecture that stood as a declaration of refinement and culture, even from the men who had first arrived as destroyers. Once again, a civilization brought to its knees had absorbed the people who knocked it down. The Mongol political structure eventually fractured, and the plateau fell into 2 centuries of chaos, a broken land of rival warlords and competing claims, with no center and no coherence. Then, in 1501, a teenager named Shah Ismail I emerged from the disorder and did something that still shapes the entire Middle East today. I founded the Safavid dynasty, fought and defeated the rival tribes, and rebuilt a unified Iranian state with borders that roughly match the Iran we recognize on a modern map. But the second thing he did was even more consequential. He converted Iran to Shia Islam by force, and the reason was not primarily religious. It was strategic genius. Iran was surrounded on every side by Sunni powers, the Ottoman Empire to the west, and the Uzbek kingdoms to the north. To remain Sunni in that position was to be indistinguishable from your neighbors, to risk being absorbed without any clear line of identity to defend. Shia was to be different in a way that could not be overlooked, to possess an identity so specifically distinct that no outside power could simply fold you into itself without a fight. Shah Ismail built a wall around the Iranian national identity that no army could fully breach. And while that wall came with real costs in blood and in isolation, it preserved the state. Isfahan, the Safavid capital, eventually became one of the most breathtaking cities on earth, a global center of art, architecture, and diplomacy so magnificent that European travelers returned home, struggling to find words adequate to describe what they had seen. And then the 19th century arrived and left Iran dangerously exposed. While Europe was transforming itself through the Industrial Revolution, while steam and steel were reshaping agriculture and warfare and medicine, Iran, under the KR dynasty, remained largely agrarian, governed more by tradition and local authority than by modern institutions capable of competing on the world stage. The result was that Iran became a buffer state, caught between 2 imperial powers, who saw it not as a proud ancient nation, but as a geographic problem to be managed. The British Empire wanted influence over it to protect India. Tsarist Russia wanted access to the south. The Khair kings, weak and deeply indebted, signed treaties that surrendered vast territories in the Caucasus and Central Asia, given away in exchange for debts and the temporary goodwill of powers that never truly respected them. To the outside world, Persia looked like a relic of an older age, a once great civilization that had somehow missed every opportunity to modernize. But the story was not over. In 1921, a military officer named Reza Khan staged a coup. And by 1925, he had crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, the founder of a new dynasty, with a mandate for rapid modernization and a determination to reduce foreign influence once and for all. He saw the name Persia not as a symbol of ancient glory, but as a colonial imposition, a label applied by Greeks who had never lived there and maintained by the British because it was convenient for them, a name that spoke of weakness and the past rather than sovereignty in the future. And so, on March 21, 1935, on the occasion of Nowruz, the Persian New Year, the Iranian government issued a diplomatic decree to all foreign nations asking them to stop using the word Persia and use dead. Name the people of this land had always used for themselves, Iran. It was not just a change of name, it was an assertion of sovereignty, as powerful as any military victory. A declaration that this nation was not a relic of ancient empires, not a piece on someone else's geopolitical board, but a modern state with a deep history and a full right to define itself on its own terms. Winston Churchill and the British government initially resisted, partly from habit and partly from the practical concern that Iran and Iraq sounded confusingly similar. But the name took hold, and a 2,500-year misunderstanding between East and West was finally officially corrected. The Pahlavi dynasty fell in a revolution so swift and total that it stunned the entire world, and the Islamic Republic rose in its place. Everything about the government changed. The ideology changed. The institutions changed. The face of power changed completely. But the name of the country did not change. The borders did not change. And the ancient, deep, enduring identity of the people who had lived on that plateau for thousands of years did not change, because it never needed to. Persia is the name of a province. Iran is the name of a nation. And the nations survived the Greeks and the Arabs and the Mongols. And the British, not because its armies were always the strongest, or its kings always the wisest, but because something in its culture was rooted so deeply, so essentially human in its refusal to be erased, that no force in history ever managed to fully pull it from the ground. Persia may be the name the world gave to a fallen empire, but Iran is the name a civilization gave to itself, and somehow against every conceivable odd, through Mongol fire and Arab conquest and colonial maneuvering and revolution, and in a half millennia of the world getting its name wrong, it is still standing today, still telling its own story in its own language, on its own terms. Daring you to look at a map of the Middle East and see not a source of modern headlines but the oldest continuous identity on Earth, quietly waiting, as it always has, for the rest of the world to finally catch up.